Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the M3 market update. This is a weekend deep dive on Memorial Day weekend. Instead of going to the beach this weekend, at the request of a follower, I'm going to do another deep dive. This time it's going to be on something called repurchases, compensatory fees, and curtailments, because I want to talk about sort of how everybody or how a certain component of the industry is going to survive over the next couple of years, and then how some of those people are going to get weeded out. And this is something in mortgage not a lot of people talk about because, as I've tried to say in a couple other videos, origination of mortgages and servicing of mortgages, these two sides rarely talk to one another. And I'll tell you a couple, since we're doing a weekend deep dive, I'll do some storytelling as well, just to kind of contextualize how this all works, because you're going to find it as crazy as I do. And I can remember times at my company, sort of the company where I would say I grew up in mortgage, and that was GMAC. It was the mortgage financing arm of GM and had a bunch of different names. But I can remember when I moved to Pennsylvania, going to after work drinks and see people from origination get into fights with people from servicing. And this is a true story because honestly, the origination people, if you were in servicing, you were trash. The origination people were kind of the more salesman-like folks. They were definitely out there, hitting the pavement, trying to sell these loans. Whereas in servicing, typically the average time you're going to have that loan on your books is about 7 years. So things go a little bit slower, and you're really about serving that customer for 7 years, not for the 45 days of the origination process. And so you have two very different mindsets. But that brings me to something that I want to talk about in origination, that why there's going to be so many problems that have already started. We're starting to hear about it even in mainstream media. It's leaking out, and we'll get to that. But why you're going to see companies collapse, and why you also see companies like Rocket and UW out there really pumping out any program to keep the engine going. And so I'll talk about this quickly. It's called gain on sale. And you book that gain on sale early in the life cycle of the loan. And this is how most companies survive. They need that booking. And it's so very similar to, if you think about Morgan Stanley, those companies that make fees off deals, gain on sale is very similar. And so it's essentially like, okay, you've just completed an app. Okay, I am allowed to book that gain as if I am going to successfully deliver that to the agencies at X price. Now, something interesting back in the day when I was more involved with the capital markets desk and unaware of all those types of things that were happening, you basically would hedge your pipeline very, very aggressively. What I can tell is a lot of people are not hedging their pipelines for interest rate risk, and that has caused some problems already. But just think about this and the idea of, if you can just keep booking that gain on sale, that revenue, you can paper over pretty much anything that happens. But the minute that that engine starts to sputter and then you start to become aware of the gremlins that are hiding in the back of the machine. And what am I talking about? Okay, so during the last cycle, there's always been these repurchase clauses when you deliver to the agencies. And what that means is they can go back to you, because let's think about the mortgage process. You're basically originating that loan, then you're delivering it, selling it to the agencies, selling it to Ginnie Mae, and you may retain servicing. And that's the right to service that loan, the right to take payments from the borrower and do everything they need to do from an administrative perspective. But that's the fee. You can retain that right, But what can happen is the agencies or they can come back to you and say, listen, you didn't underwrite this file correctly. You didn't check title correctly. Both borrowers didn't sign the note. There's all kinds of defects on the loan that they can turn around to you and say, you have to repurchase this loan back. Now think about, this is a huge thing for these guys to be able to do during a downtime, if you think about it, right? They can offload and transfer that risk. Because one thing I can tell you about this industry is that the technology is terrible. And they're using systems from 1968, 1972, and that's not exaggeration. These are blue and black screens, green and black screens, and nothing is tied together. And so the likelihood of an error on one of these files is very high. And so the agencies figured this out last time. They just kept pushing loans back to the banks, non-banks. At GMAC, where I worked, I had a very aggressive CEO that had been brought in by Cerberus. And I gotta be honest, I appreciated his style to some degree because he was proactive. And, he kind of came in and he told the agencies, this is ridiculous. I'm having to keep on staff like hundreds of people to deal with these repurchase requests. Let's just settle and be done with it. Just come up with a number that we can all agree on and we'll settle. We will be completely done with the repurchase request because that way, and he was able to do that because we were in the middle of negotiating all kinds of things. I mean, the Fed was looking at a civil money penalty. He was basically threatening bankruptcy to the Fed, saying, we're not going to pay your penalty. And so there was a lot involved in all of these different negotiations with the states and things like that. But ultimately, we did settle on our origination repurchases, unlike many people in the industry. And so this was a huge thing. Nobody had ever done this before. And we thought we were the smartest people. But then the agencies came up with something new. They called it servicing repurchases. And they were title repurchases, title related. Now, all of the title work happens in the origination process, but they wanted to say these were servicing errors. And so again, we battled with them in a way that no one else would because we were threatening at the time to pull bankruptcy. And so, there was a lot going on during this time, a lot of angry conversations with really some people's names that you would be very familiar with, put it that way. And so we never won that battle because we ultimately just filed bankruptcy. And so they, all those bills didn't get paid or not in the way that they wanted them to. But what is a repurchase? So again, it's essentially when there's some defect on the file, Fannie and Freddie, they can send it back to you, Jenny. They can say, listen, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, repurchase this loan. And then you have to buy that whole loan. Now, in today's market, most people deliver to the agencies. They do not do what we would have called private label back then. So you have some of your lenders doing what we call non-qualified mortgage, non-QM, but that is very, very tiny share compared to what it was before. So the idea, if you think about at scale, the agency's doing this to everyone who participated in that COVID boom. This is a massive impact to the industry. Now, I started warning the industry probably in mid 2020. I could already see. One of my jobs, I was working on technology, but somehow I had this little group of loan processors that reported up through me, and so I was very much aware of how things were running, and what those processors were kind of like staff augmentation to a bunch of smaller non-banks. And so I could see no one was doing anything, in my opinion, I wasn't seeing anything that was criminal, negligent, or anything like that. But you just knew with the systems that everyone used, with the manual processes, these systems, a lot of them, you can't even lock down the fields. And so, anyone can go in there and change things. And that can be very problematic when you get to the end of trying to deliver this loan with all these regulations, all these documents. So the likelihood of an error is massive. Now, you put on top of that, you don't have enough labor, you don't have enough people, and then you had all these people kind of interested and trying to get loans, etc. Like that just becomes a recipe for massive repurchases, because when I say they will have teams of people looking for an I that was not dotted. Now that's a total exaggeration, but this is what they do. This is the way they can transfer the risk back to the banks. So I was screaming about it. I was creating a technology product for it because it was a big part of my job. Back during the other cycle, I kind of headed the rep and warrant committee and brought all these people together because you could get these repurchases from all over the place for all different kinds of reasons. And it was just kind of a huge administrative battle to try to figure out what went wrong, why, or was it just like your typical insurance claim and they were rejecting it just to see if they could get away with it? Because that's the other thing, you don't want to piss off the agencies, and sorry, but you don't want to make them angry because they are your bread and butter. And so many small companies, unlike my company, which was very large at the time, they don't have any negotiation power. They just have to say, yes, we'll take the repurchase. This could have massive implications to very small institutions. And so sure enough, last week was the secondary conference in New York for the Mortgage Bankers Association, and all of the articles coming out were all about repurchases. And guys, this just feels so familiar. I can't even tell you. But funnily enough, for me, when I went to a conference and had to hear all about repurchases and all about compensatory fees, it was 2011. And so this was, that's 3 years post the biggest part of the crisis, right? And so what I'm trying to sort of get across here is that they learned how to do this. They got really, really good at it. And so this is going to be, a lever that they pull in order to protect themselves. But what's going to happen is there's all kinds of consequences throughout the industry, and it will be in a way a weeding out of the weaker players because they simply will not be able to afford these repurchases. Okay, so again, simple with the repurchases. I originate a loan. We'll talk about other types of repurchases later, but let's stick on the origination side. I originate a loan. I'm going to deliver it to the GSEs or to Ginny. If I did something that they felt was a critical defect, and they can turn around to me and say, I know you sold this loan to us, but now you have to make me whole. You have to purchase that entire loan back, and all losses will be yours. Now think about this in a default situation. And that was what was always so interesting is like many of these loans were the ones that are going into default. And so that was, a way for them to pull those loans out of the pools. Okay. So that's origination repurchases. Now, so soon you're going to start to see how, again, this industry it's not about making money anymore. It's about pushing money around. And honest to God, I don't know if it was ever in our lifetimes about making money. I wasn't around before 2006, but I can tell you what I saw post 2006. And then it just got worse and worse and worse and harder and harder and harder to make money. But so many people live in their own silo, be it origination, be it servicing. They don't really talk to one another. And so you don't have that life of loan profitability. Okay, so that's how Fannie and Freddie are going to go drain out of the independent mortgage banks. Think of these big players, guys. It's going to happen. They'll put that risk back to them and to the smaller players, and they're going to weed some folks out. So now we get to something called compensatory fees. Now, this is really, really important and crazy at the same time. And so you will hear me talk about how the mortgage industry sits in the middle of a bunch of different vested interests, none of which actually have the same, goals. And so as a servicer, you are constantly being pulled in opposite directions, and it's a very difficult task to navigate. Now, the thing about servicing is it's not sexy in any way, shape, or form. And go back to my story that started this, everybody thinks servicers are stupid. And to be honest, they actually sometimes deserve that just for the way that they operate. They operate like it's 1955. They're always backward looking. We've always done it this way. And of course, I'm generalizing hugely here, but this is most of the shops. And post the GFC, when we were in those servicing shops trying to clean everything up for all of the different regulatory bodies, we didn't have time to go out and look for new technology that could solve these problems. We had to throw bodies at the problem because we had no time. We basically, the AG monitor said, here's your metrics. You got to be ready by X date. We're going to be testing you. If you're not, money, fines. And for us, every fine, every dollar was going to put us closer to bankruptcy or blowing a covenant. And so we couldn't have it. So essentially, compensatory fees. In servicing, what happens is you get a timeline of how that default action is supposed to go. Now here becomes the problem. So Fannie Freddie, they're going to tell you, FHA is going to tell you this is how long you get to do this certain aspect of a default action. But then the CFPB is going to come in and say, nope, you've got to wait 120 days before you can even refer that loan to default. And by the way, if there's any type of loss mitigation request, you have to stop the whole action. Okay, that's national. We're going to follow that. And Fannie and Freddie will say things like, as long as this doesn't get in the way of any laws. But let's go back to, like, for instance, the COVID forbearances and all of those loss mitigation workouts. Well, Ginny never gave anybody a pass on what I would call their due diligence requirement, which meant that although you are not allowed to refer these loans to default, Ginny would actually not allow you to file for your full claim to them and would essentially curtail your claim because of that timeline delay that you had no control over. So these are the types of things that happen all the time in servicing. So on the one hand, during the crisis, you had the Fed telling us you have to review every single borrower every time they call you, no matter what. And then you had the agency saying, if you delay this, we're going to charge you a fee. And that was called a compensatory fee. And it was basically a timeline delay fee. So I had at the time, I had a whole room of people with this crazy little railroad room where I had analysts sitting there that essentially all they did was create what we call chronologies of loans in default to basically, to send back a rebuttal to these compensatory fees. And so then you could put up a hold for the compensatory fee. But then if you didn't and you forgot to put up the hold for loss mit, then they would charge you the compensatory fee. And so at the end of the last crisis, Fannie Freddie came out with I think it was $27, $28 a day is essentially what they think it costs in excess of your regular cost to hold a default loan on your books. And you would not believe the amount of fees that they charged all of the servicers and who were just crushed under all of this regulatory oversight. It didn't matter. And then, the poor borrowers, where are the borrowers in all of this? God only knows. And so, that is how difficult it can be for these companies to navigate. Now, who's a servicer? That could be, It can be Wells, it can be Chase, it can be your big banks, but it's also companies like Sinlar, it's Freedom Mortgage, it's the Money Source, it's DMI. These non-bank companies that have gotten, it's Mr. Cooper, can't believe I forgot that one, which used to be called Nation Star. They have gotten very large. And some of these companies are very interesting if you go look at some of the history of them. So these servicers are kind of in this horrible situation. I posted an article not too long ago, which I knew no one would really know what I was talking about, but it was when Rhythm kind of came out, and the CEO basically was like, well, we don't know, we can't control it. We had a bad mortgage servicing right valuation. I mean, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You hedge your MSR portfolio and you at least to 80%, and it looks like based on their results they had. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. My point is that I have a lot of deep knowledge about these companies, but it's not going to make a lot of sense to people because by the time you get to the issues in servicing, the housing cycle's on the downtrend. And so people aren't as curious about it. It becomes about the bad guys versus, that whole origination cycle. And so the bad guys are always the servicers because it's when the music stops. And then most of those originators, and this is what I came to realize this cycle, is they don't come back. And so you kind of recycle into the cycle a whole nother group of people that have no experience in this space. There's so few people left from the last crisis who were in the thick of it. And so many, and this is what was really difficult for me to understand because once I left my company, I went off to several non-bank smaller companies. But what I had realized is the crisis was very different for them. That the top five had really experienced it completely differently. And we were crucified. I mean, and listen, guys, I'm not saying that we didn't deserve it, but we were absolutely crucified. Whereas these smaller non-bank companies that were starting to pop up because of Basel III rules, really when all that came out after the crisis, it behooved bigger companies to move that servicing out, move all these risky mortgage assets out. And so these non-banks were popping up and springing up to take this. And so, I kind of went out to a lot of those to help them stand up their operation. And what I quickly realized is their concept of what had happened was very much a paper concept, meaning think about when you go to school or you go and you get your MBA and you study and you can regurgitate facts. But when you get to the rubber hits the road and you've got board governors screaming at you unbelievable things that go against all contract law, and just forcing you to do things that make absolutely no sense and nobody is listening, that's just a completely different experience than a paper experience where you are sent a memo that says, this is what we expect of you. Now, you weren't a big boy or girl, and so you didn't get those fines, but this is what we expect of you. And what then I realized is that because they weren't burned the way we had been, they didn't have the urgency to implement these things, nor did they actually interpret them the ways in which those regulatory bodies had. So as I went out to those companies, I was very much thought of as a Chicken Little. And maybe I was. I mean, honestly, maybe, I hadn't realized we had a new regime in power that wasn't as interested in crucifying us, that, the Salem witch trials were over and they had moved on. But what I can tell you is that the Salem witch trials are coming back because those non-bank entities never experienced what we experienced. Now, some of them have had minor CFPB fines post that period, but nothing like, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this, and I can't really come up with one. But just think about the worst dental cleaning you've ever had. Maybe that's the best. I mean, there was no respite, and it was nonstop. And so they never experienced any of this, and nor did they have the fear that we had. And ultimately, at the end of the day, our bankruptcy became the only option for my company. You look at some of the ones that kept going, even Wells never could outrun all of that, because to truly outrun what happened back then, you would have to completely change the technology within these places. And they are just so big, and the interests are just so vested. So on the origination side, you have ICE. They own Encompass. On the servicing side, you have Black Knight or BK. Someone asked me if I was talking about Burger King this week. No, I didn't even get the joke. I'm a little slow. Black Knight. And now those two are trying to merge. Now, if ICE sounds familiar, it should. Go look them up if you don't know who they are. So these two entities are trying to come together right now. But hopefully the FTC is involved, hoping that merger doesn't actually go, because these two companies actually hold the mortgage industry hostage. And it becomes very difficult to use any other type of software. And they make it very difficult to use any other type of software. And then people just get scared. So the types of changes, and basically both of these, all of the programs in this space, or the legacy programs, have such hard coding, no one can actually figure out how to change them or update them. And so everyone is just boxed into these solutions. And by these two entities merging, it would make it even worse. And now I had been a part of building solutions in technology that could have fixed some of these issues. But I can tell you, these guys have a monopoly, and it's very difficult. So my point is, hardly anyone addressed the actual legacy administrative issues. You have 30 systems that don't talk to each other. I've said this before, but I became a VLOOKUP queen because I had to, compare all these different data sources. And so nothing has changed, meaning that all these compensatory fees for these timeline delays will start building up again on top of your servicing repurchase request. And then let's turn our eyes to FHA, which is one of the hardest group of loans to do. And yet this is, probably one of the, a lot of non-banks want this asset because you make more fees on the upfront. And if you go to the beginning of our conversation, gain on sale, if you can just get that stuff in the door, you think you'll be fine. But the problem is there is so much involved in the filing of these claims processes. They essentially make you tell them how much you're going to be curtailed for this claim. And so what is a claim? You guys are probably looking at me like, what are you, crazy lady? Well, when you think about the fact that these loans are backed by Fannie and Freddie and backed by Ginnie Mae. Now, Fannie and Freddie, what you file claims to them for, those are expenses like default expenses, things of that nature. They'll pay that stuff back to you, sometimes. FHA, because this is backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, the idea is you're supposed to be made whole. And so if something goes wrong on that loan, the government is going to make you whole. Now, but think about any claims process you've ever been involved in before. It never goes exactly that way. And so ultimately what you as a servicer have to do is, look at the life of this loan, make sure you did everything correctly, make sure it went in the timeline, and they have this big thing called first legal. Now, what is first legal? Okay, so essentially, this is the time, this is what they call the reasonable diligence time, from when that loan is eligible to refer to foreclosure to when you take your first legal action. Now, Some states are judicial and some are non-judicial. Just to make it easier, they call it first legal. And I can tell you, I had a whole job once. My only job was making sure that loans had all of their documentation to make it to first legal on time. Now, documentation, this shouldn't be this difficult. Well, it is because you need to know where that note is. It's called verification of note. And back in the GFC days, that was a lot harder than you would even believe. And a lot of people actually think first legal means you also have to have what we call an assignment of mortgage. It depends on the state. So anyway, there's all these different requirements that you have to do in order to get this into what we call in conveyance condition when we can get this back to FHA. And if you don't, you have to self-curtail yourself this claim. And I can tell you as a servicer, just being able to coordinate everything to get these to successfully deliver claims and get them paid in a way that would not make you lose money hand over fist is very difficult. And most servicers actually would hire somebody else to do this. One of my jobs when I went out to one of these non-bank servicers was to actually create a claims department. And I got to tell you, it was, of all the things I ever did in servicing, and I've done just about everything, it was the hardest of all. And it was so mind-numbing, the amount of documentation. Where's this? Where's that? What do you have to do? Are the calculations correct? No, they're not. Okay, do you have this timeline? Okay, it's 68 days in New Jersey from this state to this, from this milestone to that milestone. And so you have groups of people having to do this. And again, nothing is automated. It's all still looking at a lot of images and things of that nature. So this is a hugely involved process. So much work goes into it. But the thing is, the claims department is at the bottom rung in servicing. No one talks to these people. And when it's a vendor, it's even worse. And so even at that big company I was working for, we had no like comprehensive system that tracked our losses on curtailments. So we couldn't even tell you how much money we were losing. We had this old proprietary database called the loss control database that people went and manually typed reasons, etc. in. And so how do companies paper over that? They have to keep that gain on sale engine going. So essentially, with repurchases, with curtailments, with compensatory fees, these are the ways that these government-backed entities are going to survive the next few years. But what will happen to many people is they will get wiped out because they weren't expecting this. They weren't forecasting it. They didn't believe it. I can tell you, I have talked to many groups of people about this. And I had to just sit back and not say anything anymore. And then here we are. Things are coming out at this conference. It's leaking into mainstream media. They're even talking about that some of these repurchases are going to keep people from doing M&A deals. Now, I think that's probably a little, whining going on. But again, though, it's an unknowable risk. I mean, you can only look at percentages, historical percentages, to try and gauge this. But would you really want to buy an asset where you had significant risks that you would then need to pony up a whole bunch more money for things that you didn't do? So what do typically what you'll do is write some sort of rep and warrant agreement in the M&A deal. That's what we did. But that's the type of thing that makes these things more complicated during this time. So a lot happens after the boom. And we're in that time that could drag these companies down much more so than just not having enough origination. Because to be honest, most companies who have both origination and servicing do not understand servicing. They do not understand these losses. And it has been a very, very long time for these things to happen at scale, 15 years essentially. And we've lost a ton of people from the industry. So you're about to have people get really surprised. And it doesn't matter. And the same people that I have been talking to about this are still going to be surprised because they just don't understand what's happening, what's about to happen, and that this is the way that these government-backed entities are going to get through this down cycle. So hopefully that helped you guys sort of understand what happens next in the industry. And it feels like so many people have forgotten this part of the cycle. They're still looking toward origination kind of ramping back up. But these narratives are going to start to get louder because, and one more thing I want to say, which was what I was trying to say with the rhythm post, that for these joint origination and servicers, the good times are gone. Now all is pain, and hopefully they have managed their capital positions to be able to take it and write it out. But what I'm hearing and seeing is it doesn't really look that way, because if you're crying about MSR valuations, which that's totally knowable. There are models out there, there's hedging that can be done, etc. If they're crying about this, if they're crying about the amount of repurchases they've seen so far, and I've looked at the charts, this is nothing. And so, and it also means that they're not prepared for what's to come. And this is, honestly how I felt 2 years ago. But when all of the moratoriums came, again, it was just an opportunity. Everybody got to kick the can down the road, and nobody made the changes that they needed to make. And they threw bodies at a problem, again, not technology. And so there are going to be very few people that survive this next part of the cycle in a way that means they'll be around for some time. And you're going to start to see crazy things happen. One quick story, talking about documentation and why this becomes such a huge problem. When TBW kind of got shut down, Fannie came in, took all the notes, all the collateral documents overnight. For those of us that then got that servicing, because then Fannie forced servicing to be transferred to different companies, we had none of the documents, none of them. Nobody ever found them again. And so then we had to go try to take these default actions. And again, guys, don't forget that these servicers are taking these default actions in their names. Fannie and Freddie won't let them take that default action in their name, even though they own the note. So there's all kinds of transfer of risk that is honestly way too risky for many to be able to sustain through this down cycle. So that was a lot of information, I know, but repurchases, compensatory fees, curtailment. This is the dark side of the boom. And you're about to start hearing about it even more. And it could very likely get in the way of initial deals. But there will always be some players that come in. There's still a few players left from last time. But it's important to understand when you're trying to look at the health of the housing industry and look at the health of these companies, that the risk is not just in lower origination. The risk is what's coming next. Okay, sorry, it's Memorial Day weekend. I probably shouldn't sound so doomy, but I just want to get this out there. Hopefully this is helpful, but please leave me a comment, questions. I'll do more of these deep dives, and as you can see, if you request, I'll do one. So please just send me a comment, and happy to do a deep dive. Again, you can reach me on Twitter at m3_melody. You can reach me at LinkedIn, Melody Wright. You can reach me at Substack on M3 Melody Substack, and then here on YouTube. And, I'm going to just keep working to kind of get this information out to you guys. But please, your feedback on the content is very much appreciated. So Thanks again for listening, and I hope to hear from you. Have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you.